Are you new to Facebook Live?
Oh, I guess so. I mean, I've watched it a lot. I have a favorite person on Facebook Live, which is Heather Cox Richardson, who comments about politics every day, or actually twice a week on Facebook. And it's really, really interesting. She's a history professor at Boston College, and she really knows her American history, and she fits everything that's happening now into a historical perspective. So it's really fun to watch her.
So you've been a viewer.
Yeah, I've been a viewer, but not a participant. Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully in 1 minute, we'll both launch our personal experience with Facebook.
Is this a first experience for you too, Mary Angela?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
I thought, I mean, I think that whoever told Danny that Instagram is the way to go, I think they're right. Although I hate Instagram. I find it very hard to use. Very hard to use. Complicated.
You know why, Nancy? It wasn't designed for our demographic.
No, it certainly was not.
That's what because I work a lot with interns and students, and they say, oh, you just do this. And it's easy for you to say.
Just click on the cross, they say.
Well, here we go. It's 11:30.
Okay.
So I want to welcome everyone today to Cooking Up a Conversation with Mary Angela. And today, I'm cooking up a conversation with the godmother of Mediterranean diet cookbooks, Nancy Harmon Jenkins, and we're hosted here by the Mediterranean Diet Live Roundtable in their kitchen stories. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why Nancy is the godmother, and then we're going to talk about two of her recipes. I'm going to share my caper in search of capers and learning about capers. And then we're going to have Nancy walk us through the second recipe, which is a pasta dish and what I would call Pasta 101. But Nancy, tell us why you are called the godmother of the Mediterranean Diet Cookbook.
Well, I am not actually sure because I don't call myself that, but I have been involved with the Mediterranean for a long time. I had the great privilege of living in various countries around the Mediterranean for about 15 years with a husband who was then a foreign correspondent, and we moved frequently, and I tasted and ate and cooked and gardened and went to markets and so forth. But then in the early 1990s, and I can't remember the exact date, it might have been 1990, 1991, there was a conference held in Cambridge, Massachusetts that was partially sponsored by Old Ways Preservation Trust, which was an organization that I had been a founding director of, and the Harvard School of Public Health. And it was to look at what was then called for the first time the Mediterranean diet and why the health profiles of people who followed that diet was so favorable. So they assembled experts, scientists, researchers, nutritionists, etc., from all over the world. And we talked and talked and talked for 3 days. And out of that grew my first book, which was called, with great creativity, the Mediterranean Diet Cookbook. And a signal to that, that whole diet was olive oil. I almost said extra virgin olive oil, but it wasn't. It was just olive oil. 10 years or so later, or maybe it was 15 years later, I wrote the new Mediterranean Diet Cookbook. That's this one that we're looking at today. Yeah. And I wrote that because in the intervening years, we had learned so much more about olive oil and why extra virgin olive oil is important, much more so than just normal olive oil. I can explain that to you if you want me to, but you know I go on and on at the mouth if you don't.
Well, the great thing is, though, that's all in the book. And I enjoyed, as a dietitian, I just enjoyed reading the history because your book is filled with scientific information as well as food information. And you were the first one to do that. So I believe that's why you're the godmother. Back when you were doing all that, learning that, well, in the late 80s anyways, I was being the cardiac dietitian at the Cleveland Clinic. And, they have one of the best heart programs in the country. Mm-hmm. And you and I were chatting this week about cardiovascular disease runs rampant in both our families. So we're very concerned about that. Yeah. And we were telling people to do things very differently with the fat in their diets back then because we didn't know then what we know now. We knew nothing about olive oil back then, mm-hmm. and we certainly weren't recommending it. So it's been very, very interesting to watch the transition with that. I mean, is there any other thing about olive oil you do want to tell us before we get into the recipe?
Well, I do want to emphasize that it's extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil has these antioxidant polyphenols in it, which are a major part of the health impact that it has. It's also a very good fat. It's what do you call it? A monounsaturated fat.
Monounsaturated.
That's very good for you. But it's the a regular olive oil is also a monounsaturated fat. What extra virgin has is that extra boost of polyphenols that are very good as cancer preventives, diabetes preventives, all kinds of, even dementia seems to be mitigated to a certain extent by an extra virgin olive oil in your diet. So it's not a cure-all for anything, but it will help keep you in good health for as long as you live, I hope.
In this dish that we make, really, that's the only source of fat. So let me tell you about the recipe today, because I always reach out to my authors, and Nancy suggested 3 recipes, and one was a lentil salad, and I know I have to tackle lentils before the series is over, but I'm not tackling them today. But one of my goals was to increase the amount of seafood in my diet and to always try a new ingredient. Now, believe it or not, I had never cooked with capers, and I live here in the Midwest. So I always, our goal with this series is to make the diet accessible to people. So I went out and I asked 10 people, have you ever eaten capers or have you ever cooked with capers? And the very first person that responded to me said, "What is a caper? You eat them?" And that's the person that I asked over to share your dish with me, okay? But really, 5 people said they had never, ever eaten a caper. 2 said they had eaten them at a restaurant. And then a few more said they had cooked with them. One, of course, is my sister who has a Greek husband, so she's cooked with capers. And another one said that she had cooked a Cuban dish with capers. So I thought that was interesting. But I was worried I couldn't find capers, but I did. I found them in the condiment section of my store. But tell us what a caper is, because obviously many people here where I live aren't familiar with them as an ingredient.
And that's astounding to me because they're very familiar to me, although they weren't when I was growing up in Maine. But now, they're on the regular supermarket shelves, all have capers, various sizes from various parts of the world. Basically, it's the bud of a flower. It's a very beautiful flower. It grows mainly on dry walls around the Mediterranean. And you'll see these gorgeous, almost vine-like strands hanging over the walls. And in springtime, they come out with these beautiful flowers. Before they form the flower, however, there's the bud. And that's what's picked. And either pickled, like the ones you bought, or salted. And I actually prefer the salted ones.
Okay, that's good to know.
More of the caper flavor, and you can find those very easily online. You don't I don't find them in my local supermarket. I order them from various online purveyors. But and the salted ones have to be rinsed very carefully, obviously, to rid them of the salt before you use them. But that's just a question of putting them in a colander and running water over them. They surprisingly, for such a tiny little thing, they have a certain amount of nutritional impact, which is
yes. They're called superfoods.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I still think you might have to eat an awful lot of them to gain the benefits from it, but that's okay. And they're widely used in the Mediterranean because they add a kind of pungent kick. That not pungent like chili peppers, but pungent like vinegary things, or I call them pointed flavors. You have them in your mouth and you think, wow, that's good, but you can't figure out what it is at first, and then you realize it's a caper. And they're very often mixed with olives. They're often put into tomato sauces. They're all kinds of sauces use them. That French olive paste that they make called tapenade. That's called tapenade because here's an interesting question. Tapenade means caper in the Provençal dialect. So that we think of it as a black olive paste. It's actually supposed to be a caper paste with some black olives in it. But it always has capers in it, and that's part of its deliciousness, of course.
In this recipe, so it's baked fish with capers and olives, which is just what it is, and a tomato sauce. But it only had a tablespoon of capers and green olives. And I will tell you that when I went to buy the fish, I looked up your recommendations, and I made the mistake of going late in the day. Now, of course, many of our grocery stores have more limited hours right now. Yeah. And I went to our local Italian store because I was looking for some of the other ingredients in our next recipe. And they didn't have many fish left to choose from for the day, but I picked haddock because they had that and it wasn't frozen. But my thought was, it almost didn't matter what fish I chose because it's not the dominant flavor in this recipe.
No.
The capers and the olives and the sauce were. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, a lot of people aren't fish lovers, and I agree with you that we should be eating a great deal more fish for all kinds of reasons, including environmental ones. But you could use that recipe with just about any kind of fish that you can buy in a thick fillet or a steak, like a salmon fillet, for instance, or haddock, cod, halibut, all of those things. I love serving it with a swordfish steak because I like the texture that swordfish has.
Okay.
And that's a nice contrast. But it's actually, it's a kind of dish that you could serve once a week. And even picky eaters wouldn't necessarily know that they're eating the same thing. And nowadays that we're all cooking 3 times a day, it's inevitable that we're going to end up serving the same thing over and over again. So this is a great dish for that. You vary the fish. You could add black olives instead of green olives. And tease them that way. You could add, and I think I said this in the recipe, if you want to give it a kind of Greek flavor, I would say add a pinch of really good quality dried oregano and some grated lemon zest to it, and that will change the flavor, and they won't realize they had the same thing last week. It's kind of a basic recipe with which you can do all kinds of things once you've mastered. Let's call it a master recipe. Once you've mastered that technique, which is very, very easy.
Which is, if I can make it, anyone can make it.
Great. And then you can go on from there and experiment with different, I think right here in Maine, where I am, at this time of the year, we're getting a lot of smelts coming in. And smelts are small fish that are usually sold whole and eaten whole and not filleted at all. But I could see whole small fish being cooked in this sauce.
Okay, I would never have thought of that.
Being cooked in this sauce. And mackerel is a wonderfully healthy fish that a lot of people avoid because they say they don't like the fishy flavor. But of course, the sauce conceals the fishy flavor. So it's a win-win situation, except for the fish.
And when I was, as I mentioned, I've been really trying to have more seafood in my diet. I'll be honest with you, I have not had a dish before with tomato sauce and fish. So that was another reason why I wanted to try this. Not only did it have, was it seafood? Not only did it have capers as a new ingredient, I'm just used to fish being blackened or, grilled, but not cooked in a tomato sauce. So I thought that was an interesting thing to try. Now, my friend who didn't know what a caper was, when he tasted it, he said, so that must be the caper. And then I let him taste one from the jar. But I have a question for you on that. And it was very good. And as you and I were trading emails this week, and I said, I'm going in to start cooking. And you said, I wish I was there to help you. Gosh, I wish you were here to help me too. Because I think this is a dish that if I had you in the kitchen, it might have been executed a little better. But I don't want to waste food. What could I do? What can I do with these leftover capers?
Well, yeah, anytime you're making any kind of particularly a tomato sauce, throw a tablespoon of capers in, or a mayonnaise. Do you ever make mayonnaise? I love making mayonnaise.
Now, remember why I'm doing this? Because I know a lot about food and I love food, but I'm not that good of a cook. No, I have never, ever attempted mayonnaise.
Well, it's a lot of fun and you don't have to cook because you just dump it all in your.
That's my
But aioli is a big deal with chefs.
Oh, I love aioli, yes.
Aioli. I say the hell with aioli. It's basically just garlic mayonnaise. So if you add capers to the mayonnaise, and honestly, you can take it right out of the jar and put it in a bowl and chop up some capers and add them to it and call it caper aioli, and everybody will think you're a fabulous cook.
Oh, well, that's good. Now, is there a mayonnaise recipe in this book? I'll have to look to see if there is.
There probably is. I almost always include a mayonnaise recipe because I started making it when I lived in Spain when I couldn't get good quality bottled mayonnaise.
Uh-huh.
American mayonnaise. I think I'm not going to mention any brand names because I probably shouldn't, but there's some very good bottled mayonnaises available in this country. They're not always, back in those days, they weren't always available abroad. So I started making my own, and I discovered that it was fun and it was easy. And once you've mastered the technique of adding the oil slowly to the eggs that are still going around in the blender or the Cuisinart or whatever, if you master that technique, you get a really terrific product from it. And if you're not afraid of raw eggs, that's the other thing to caution people about, because some people are, with good reason, probably. I'm not, but I tend to think I'm going to live to be 125 from eating raw eggs and various things like that.
Well, you have to be careful. Food safety is one of my other passions. Yeah. And if you have any type of immune condition, what about 20% of eggs might have salmonella? So just be careful with them. Undercooked eggs, when I worked in the healthcare food service industry, we could never serve undercooked eggs because we had a patient population. Yeah. And even in restaurants here, we have to put a notice up that says if you're eating a raw or undercooked egg, you're doing it at your own risk. But you can make your own decisions. All right, now
using a jar mayonnaise, using a mayonnaise that comes in a jar, if it's a good quality mayonnaise, is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And just throw your chopped capers in. There you are.
I'm going to give that a try because I don't want to throw my capers away. All right, now our next recipe is called, and I have to look at my notes that I wrote, Bucatini alla matriciana.
Yes, that's correct.
You say it.
Bucatini alla matriciana.
Alla matriciana.
Yeah.
And so pasta is much more in my wheelhouse. Why? For a couple of reasons. As I mentioned, I'm not a great cook, but I'm a resourceful cook. And if you have pasta in your house, you can always come up with the dinner. You called it the original fast food in your book, which I just loved. Yeah. I said that this makes me feel good because you can make a quick dinner with it. So this dish had guanciale in it. And I knew how to pronounce guanciale because I once had a friend named Terry Guanciale. But it's pig cheek, pig jowl.
The jowls at this part right here. I've got plenty of them. You can, and in Italy, traditionally that part is salted just like prosciutto and aged for a bit, and you use it. But I think that Italians would hate to hear me say this, but I think this recipe is just as good using bacon if you can. I'd use a thick cut of really good quality bacon. Or pancetta, sometimes easier to find than guanciale if you don't have a butcher around. But bacon is perfectly fine in it. It's what I love about this recipe is that you probably have all of those ingredients in your pantry. You've got the pasta, you've got some bacon in the meat drawer of your refrigerator. You've got cans of high quality Italian imported tomatoes in your pantry. And what else goes in it? I can't remember.
The pasta and the pecorino cheese you recommended. And really, those were the three main ingredients, I think. But I'm glad I found the guanciale because it was delicious.
Oh, it is. It's fabulous.
Yes. And you only use, so this is a dish that you cook a pound of the guanciale with the garlic and the onion. And the whole recipe then, which I used for 4 meals, and I only made half of the pasta, right? Because that was when I was eating alone. So you have this tremendous flavor from this guanciale. And I will tell you, the bites of the pasta when you're done, the ones with the guanciale in it are just the best bites of pasta. So the other question I had for you, though, was the bucatini. So I wanted to find bucatini, and I looked it up, and I'm still not sure I bought the right kind of pasta. So when I looked it up, it said, and it was like this long pasta with a hole in it. So I don't know if you can see there's a little hole in it, but I thought you were describing more of a penne. So this is what I use, but what was your intent?
No, the bucatini, definitely for amatriciana, just because that's the way it's always served in Rome, where it's a very popular dish. The penne go with something called arrabbiata, which is
the one on the next page.
The exact same sauce, except that it has a lot of crushed red chili peppers in it, which is why it's arrabbiata, which means it's enraged with the chili peppers. But the
and
bucatini is a very funny, I mean, you certainly could make this with spaghetti. You could make it with trenette. You could make it with any long, skinny pasta at all.
well, this was delicious. No, I was glad I found it.
I'm glad you found it too, because I've been reading about bucatini lately, and apparently there is a shortage of bucatini in this country, and I cannot begin to explain to you why that should be. I mean, why do people suddenly want to go out? But probably some food magazine or chef or others said, "Oh, you can only do this with bucatini," and everybody went out and bought bucatini, and it went the way of toilet paper and cleaning fluids and things like that. In a pandemic, everything gets used up very quickly. So don't worry about the bucatini. Use spaghetti instead. Use linguine. Use trenette, use any of those long, skinny Italian pastas.
So you cook this up, you brown the guanciale, or you saute the guanciale with the vegetables. And then I used the canned tomatoes. And I will tell you, again, our goal is to be adaptable here. You relieved me when I read in your book. It was relieving to say that you could use a good quality canned tomato, and that might even be a better choice than a poor quality fresh tomato.
Right. Yeah.
And we always want to use fresh ingredients, certainly, but we might have an issue here in central Ohio, right in the middle of, cold weather season. So I used them, and it was delicious. Now, there was another tip you gave us that I thought was just great. You said that we could cook the pasta till it was not quite done, but then finish it off in the sauce for those last few minutes. And I did that, and that was just delicious.
That's fantastic. That's called, in Italian, it's called saltare in padella, which means to saute it in the pan. And that's exactly what you do. You drain the pasta. I usually keep aside a little bit of pasta water in case it gets too thick. But you drain most of the pasta, and you dump the pasta right into the sauce and let it finish cooking in the sauce. And you've got that extra pasta water on the side in case it thickens or starts to stick to the pan or something. And you just add a ladle of pasta water to the pan to loosen it up.
So that's a good point. I would have never thought of doing that. While we have you, I mean, could you walk us through maybe pasta, what I would call 101? Because, I grew up with an Italian mother. And so I think I make pasta the way she made pasta without ever really thinking about it. But I'm not sure that we made pasta the way that maybe our godmother of the Mediterranean diet makes pasta. I mean, I looked at your ratios and I really tried to use the water that you recommend, but just go through like the 4 or 5 steps to making pasta.
Okay, well, number one is you need a lot of water. And I think to cook a pound of pasta, which is what most boxes have, a pound or 500 milligrams, which is roughly the same, you need 6 quarts of water. So you need a big pot, and you fill it up with 6 quarts of water. You either add salt at the beginning or you add salt after it starts to boil. I have a dispute with my daughter over that. You bring it to a vigorous boil. I mean, it shouldn't be just simmering. It should really be bubbling. And then you put in the pasta. And if it's long pasta especially, you have to really stir it with a wooden spoon to get all of that pasta kind of submerged into the water. As it softens in the water and loosens, it will start to mix in. And so that's basically it. You cook it to your taste. And the health doctors, scientists will say that undercooked pasta has a lower glycemic index than overcooked pasta. You may know the reason for that, Mary Angela. I certainly don't. But cook it to your taste. If you like it al dente, as they say in Italian, then do it that way. If you like it softer, if you're cooking for an old man who's lost his teeth, you might want it softer. When it's at the point that you really want to eat it, turn it into a colander that you have ready in the sink and turn it immediately into a warm bowl. And then, this is assuming we're not doing that saltare in padella that we talked about. Turn it into a warm bowl. Add a little bit of olive oil and stir it around to loosen it up, and then add your sauce on the top of that and send it right to the table then. Don't wait. In Italy, you're not allowed to speak when the pasta is served because everybody should just get to. The other thing in Italy about pasta is if the hostess is at the table and serving individual people, the minute you have your pasta in front of you, you start eating. You don't sit back politely and wait for everyone to be served, because it's an insult to the cook not to start immediately eating your pasta.
That is another tip I didn't know. And
But
one
the other thing is the salt, by the way, and salt, plenty of salt. I mean, even not a handful, but a half handful of salt in that water is fine. You're not going to be eating that salt. It's going to be flavoring the pasta, but you're not going to be eating a handful of salt. So don't be afraid of salt when you're making anything that goes into boiling water.
The other thing that you didn't mention, but I think we should point out, is you said, do not rinse your pasta.
Right. Don't rinse your pasta. Don't rinse it at all, because there's just no point to it. First of all, it will chill the pasta down, even if you rinse it with hot water. And it just, it's an insane thing to have to do. It doesn't have any rhyme or reason. It's one of those rules that, our mothers grew up with. Your mother probably didn't, but my mother did. And it doesn't make any sense. It's just, you're rinsing away flavor when you do that, because pasta is think of it as a starchy vegetable, which is really what it is, a starchy vegetable, a carbohydrate. And when you rinse away the starch, you're rinsing away the flavor of it. So you don't want to do that.
All right. So cook it with lots of water,
And
bring
lots
it to a
of
boil, add lots of salt, don't rinse it, and taste it the minute it hits the table. So that's
Right.
Pasta 101 from Nancy Harmon Jenkins. Now, the other thing that I read in your book, honestly, that made me chuckle, and that's just our reminder that we have a few minutes left, was using maybe the sauce as a condiment on the pasta. I love red sauce. And the family table that I grew up with was, we would have our pasta and we would have a gravy boat, not kidding, full of extra sauce on the table. So we just had our pasta swimming in sauce. But I tried yours with the pasta on top of the sauce.
Yeah.
And this is so flavorful and more substantial than the pasta that I'm used to, that it was fine. Fine.
Well, that's the Italian way too.
Okay.
It's the important piece of the meal of the dish is the pasta, not the sauce. So the sauce is there to dress the pasta. This is an old tradition for poor people all over the world. Your basic carbohydrate, which is usually kind of dull and bland, is sauced with something to make it go down more easily. And that's really what pasta is. I mean, it's been fancified and glorified and turned into great things, but basically it's poor people's food with a condiment to make it go down.
Well, and I didn't realize it in that way, that it could be just a way to make a staple more acceptable or more.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, you gave me a hint, because I don't like to waste food, correct?
Yeah.
About using leftover pasta in a frittata, did you say?
Yes, exactly. A frittata, an Italian omelet. And that's another great secret too. Most kinds of pasta, I wouldn't do this with any of the filled pastas, any ravioli or anything like that. All the other kinds of pasta, you've got some left over. Maybe you've got, a portion left over that nobody's going to eat. So the next day, this is this trick of getting them to eat the same thing 2 days in a row. You beat up a bunch of eggs. Now, depending on how much pasta you have and how many people you're going to serve, it could be 3 eggs. It could be 5 eggs. It could even be, I suppose, it could be as much as 10 eggs. So that's kind of hard to cook. And you just mix the pasta right in that. Add some salt if you think it's necessary. Taste it, some pepper maybe. And then take out your skillet and add olive oil and run the olive oil all around, just as you would with an omelet. And when it's good and hot, you pour in that egg and pasta mixture and let it cook. And you stir it up a little bit to make sure that the runny part gets down on the bottom and starts to cook. And in the end, what you've got is a pasta frittata that will make another lunch for maybe 2 people or 3 people, depending on how many eggs you've got and how much pasta you've got. But it's a great way to use up leftovers of any kind, I think, but especially pasta.
No, I love that idea. And I would never have thought of using my leftover pasta in a frittata. One other thing then before we close, you've not just written the original Mediterranean Diet Cookbook and the new Mediterranean Diet Cookbook. You've written some other books.
Yes.
And you were telling me, well, just tell us about your other books.
Oh gosh, there's so many of them. It's hard to know where to begin. But the most recent book I did was with my daughter, who's a chef and has a restaurant here, called The Four Seasons of Pasta, which is a pasta book to follow around the year, spring, summer, winter, and fall and winter. And that was a lot of fun to do. And
Wow.
before that, I wrote, this book, which I happen to have right here, Virgin Territory, which is all about olive oil. Because, I also make olive oil in Tuscany. I know people roil in envy when I say that, but I have this old farm in Tuscany with 150 trees, and we make our own olive oil. And I have gotten passionately interested in olive oil, both because it's so good for us and it should be part of a healthy diet, but also because of the history of it. It goes back such a long ways in the Mediterranean, and it's so fundamental to the Mediterranean diet that learning about it and learning about how it's made. I was in Spain a little over a year ago before COVID hit, on an olive farm there, or the olive farms in Sicily, olive farms on the island of Crete, and even in Lebanon, where I had the great good fortune to live before the whole country was torn up by civil war. Even there, the olive oil was splendid and just such an important part of the diet that people would lay in their supplies in the fall when the olives were harvested and crushed, and lay in their supplies for the entire winter. It was a wonderful experience. So I've learned a lot about it. And in that book, I was trying to transmit it to as many people as I could.
Well, great. Nancy, thank you so much. Not only for meeting with us today, but walking me through this and, on my caper for capers and teaching me about guanciale, which I still have a half a pound to use now and some other delicious recipe. And really for walking us through Pasta 101. I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure we all have today, and making the Mediterranean diet more adaptable and accessible to those of us who aren't chefs. So I want to thank you for joining us. Next week, we're going to tackle lentils with Chef Maria Loy's Greek diet, so we can feel like a Greek goddess. But with that, I want to close and just thank you for your time today. And thank you to the Mediterranean Diet Roundtable for hosting Cooking Up a Conversation with the godmother of the diet, Nancy Harmon Jenkins. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Angela. And thanks to the Mediterranean Diet Roundtable for putting up with me. Thank you.
It was my pleasure.